Before we begin, if you enjoy wandering through the strange and sleepy corners of history, consider subscribing to Nightfall Notions for more tales that are just unsettling enough to keep you company in the dark. Tonight's story is Chapter 1, The Summoning to the Royal Kitchens. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which was already a bad sign. Tuesdays, in the humble opinion of Bertrand the barely edible, were cursed. The bread always burned on Tuesdays. The soup curdled by noon. Once, an entire wheel of cheese had spontaneously combusted in his pantry, and no one, least of all Bertrand, could explain why. So when the royal seal glinted up at him from the parchment, his first instinct was to throw it into the fireplace and pretend he'd never seen it. But curiosity, like a poorly seasoned stew, gnawed at him. He broke the seal with trembling fingers. The words inside were crisp, bureaucratic, and utterly horrifying. High be, order of His Majesty King Florian the Famished. You are hereby summoned to serve as head royal chef at Castle Glutmond, effective immediately. Fine. Bertrand read it 3 times. Then he laughed. Then he panicked. Then he laughed again, because the alternative was weeping into his last decent apron. It had to be a mistake, or a prank, or a cruel experiment by the royal court to see how long a man could survive on sheer terror, alone, because everyone in the kingdom knew Bertrand's reputation. His roasted meats were charcoal tributes to the fire gods. His pastries could double as masonry. His signature dish, arcoque au catastrophe, had once been described by a food critic as a crime against poultry and humanity alike. And yet here was the crown, in all its oblivious glory, demanding his services. The summons gave no explanation, but Bertrand had theories. Perhaps the previous royal chef had died of shame after under-seasoning a consommé. Maybe the king had lost his sense of taste in a tragic jousting accident. Or, and this seemed most likely, the court had simply run out of chefs willing to work under the notoriously peckish monarch, whose temper was as short as his patience for soggy vegetables. Bertrand spent the night packing his knives, his one unburnt cookbook, and a sack of onions for emotional support. At dawn a carriage arrived, its gilded edges mocking his peasant sensibilities. The driver, a man with the expression of someone who had seen too many chefs come and go, handed him a sealed note. Inside, in jagged script, were the words, "A key not to kill anyone on your first day." And the journey to Castle Glutmond was a blur of dread and poorly maintained roads. Bertrand rehearsed apologies in his head. "Your Majesty, the roast is intentionally blackened. A bold new culinary trend from the south. Your Majesty, the soup is minimalist. A broth for the modern palate." By the time the castle loomed into view, a towering monument to excess, its spires gleaming like over-baked meringues, he had accepted his fate. He was going to die here, probably by being forced to eat his own cooking. The royal kitchens were a cavern of steam and shouting, a symphony of clattering pots and the occasional scream. Dozens of sous chefs, scullions, and pastry assassins scurried about, their faces streaked with flour and existential despair. At the center of it all stood Lady Marguerite de Crème, the king's food taster and professional pessimist. She took one look at Bertrand and sighed. "Oh, you're the one they sent." Bertrand opened his mouth to defend himself, but at that moment a herald's trumpet blared. The king was hungry. And so, with a pit in his stomach deeper than a poorly kneaded dough, Bertrand the barely edible took his place at the helm of the royal stove, gripped a ladle like a weapon, and prepared to fail magnificently. Chapter 2. A kitchen fit for a king, or a disaster. The royal kitchens of Castle Glutmond were less a place of culinary artistry, and more a battleground where ingredients went to die. The air was thick with the scent of burning butter, the sharp tang of over-reduced wine, and the ever-present undercurrent of fear. Copper pots hung from the ceiling like the armor of fallen warriors, dented from battles with stubborn sauces and ill-timed caramelization. Bertrand stepped forward, immediately tripping over a misplaced sack of turnips. The kitchen staff barely glanced up. They had seen incoming chefs before, bright-eyed, ambitious, destined for either greatness or disgrace. Bertrand, with his sweat-damp collar and the haunted look of a man who had once set a salad on fire, clearly belonged to the latter category. Lady Marguerite de Crème, who had the posture of a heron and the patience of a starving wolf, flicked a speck of non-existent dust from her sleeve. "You will address the staff," she announced, as if informing him of his own execution. Bertrand cleared his throat. A junior scullion dropped a ladle with a clatter that echoed like a death knell. "Ah, yes. Hello. I am Bertrand. I cook." This was met with silence. A pigeon which had somehow gotten inside cooed derisively from a rafter. Marguerite sighed. "The king expects his midday meal in precisely 1 hour. The menu is boar and cherry reduction, saffron-infused parsnip puree, and a pear tart that does not, under any circumstances, resemble last week's tragic cobblestone incident." Bertrand felt his knees wobble. He had never cooked boar. He had once attempted to roast a turkey and ended up with something that could have been used to patch a roof. Before he could protest, a wiry man with a scar across his nose, the head butcher, Gaston, leaned in. The last chef tried to serve the king undercooked meat. They found him in the moat. Funny thing, moats. They preserve bodies like pickles. He grinned, showing a missing tooth. The kitchen erupted into motion. Apprentices scrambled to stoke fires, knead dough, and peel vegetables with the frantic energy of sailors bailing out a sinking ship. A harried woman named Claudette, who seemed to be in charge of sauces, shoved a wooden spoon into Bertrand's hand. "Steer," she commanded. "If it curdles, we're all dead." Bertrand stirred. The pot hissed at him. Across the room, a pastry chef was muttering incantations over a tray of delicate puff pastry, as if praying to some deity of flakiness. The head spit-turner, a burly man with forearms like ham-hocks, glared at the boar like it had personally insulted his ancestors. Everywhere Bertrand looked, there were knives, flames, and people who clearly knew more than he did. Then came the sound that froze the entire kitchen, a distant bell, deep and sonorous. The king had rung for his meal. Marguerite's face went pale. "He's early." A terrible realization dawned on Bertrand. He was not just bad at cooking. He was catastrophically, legendarily bad. And now, an entire kitchen's worth of people who had families, probably, were depending on him. Claudette grabbed his shoulder. "Chef, the sauce is splitting." Gaston called from the roasting pit. "The boar's still bleeding." The pastry chef let out a sound like a deflating souffle. Bertrand closed his eyes. Somewhere, a distant part of his brain whispered that this would make a fantastic story, provided he lived to tell it. Then he opened them, squared his shoulders, and did the only thing he could think of. "Everyone, stop." The kitchen froze. Even the pigeon paused mid-strut. Bertrand took a deep breath. "We are going to serve the king the worst meal of his life." Silence. Then, slowly, Marguerite's lips curled into something resembling a smile. "Go on." Bertrand gestured wildly. "The boar is undercooked. Fine. Call it Exanglia à la Royale, a daring tribute to the hunt. The sauce is broken. That's modernist cuisine. The pear tart is hard as a brick. It's I deconstructed tart, a playful commentary on the fragility." The staff exchanged glances. The butcher scratched his chin. The pastry chef's eyes lit up. Marguerite studied Bertrand for a long moment. Then she nodded. "Either you're a genius, or we're all going to the dungeon, but at least it'll be interesting." With that, the kitchen burst back into motion. this time with a renewed sense of madness. Bertrand, for the first time in his life, felt a flicker of hope. Or maybe it was indigestion. The platters were assembled, the dishes arranged with deliberate absurdity. As the servers carried the meal toward the king's hall, Bertrand wiped his brow with a cloth that had probably been used to strain poison at some point. Somewhere above, the pigeon cooed again, as if to say, "This should be fun." Chapter 3. The First Royal Meal. A charred offering. The grand dining hall of Castle Gluckmond was a spectacle of gilded excess, a place where candlelight flickered off polished silver, and the king's temper flickered even brighter. Long tapestries, depicting past culinary triumphs, or perhaps just flattering interpretations of them, lined the walls, their threads fraying at the edges like the nerves of everyone present. Servants stood stiffly along the walls, their faces carefully blank, as if they had trained for years to become part of the furniture. At the head of the table, King Florian the Famished sat with the posture of a man who had never once in his life been served a meal that met his expectations. His fingers drummed against the tablecloth, each tap sounding like the ticking of a clock, counting down to Bertrand's doom. Beside him, Lady Marguerite de Crème arranged her features into something resembling serenity, though her knuckles were white around the stem of her wineglass. Then the doors swung open. A procession of servers entered, balancing platters that smelled faintly of desperation. The first dish, the infamous Sangria à la Royale, was presented with a flourish. The boar glistened pink in the center, its juices pooling ominously around a garnish of wilting herbs. The king's eyebrow twitched. Marguerite leaned in. "A bold homage to the hunt, your majesty. The chef insists the rareness enhances the primal experience." King Florian speared a slice with his fork, held it up to the light, and frowned. "This meat is still whispering." Bertrand, watching from the kitchen doorway, felt his stomach drop into his shoes. The servers moved on to the next course, the Wei Modernistique broken sauce, now congealing artfully around the edges of the plate. The king dipped a finger in, tasted it, and set his jaw. "This sauce has given up Chiny." Marguerite coughed delicately. "An intentional deconstruction, sire. The separation of flavors represents the duality of man." By the time the eye deconstructed a pear tart arrived, a geological formation of burnt pastry and weeping fruit, the king's expression had settled into something beyond anger, beyond disappointment. It was the quiet, terrifying calm of a man who had seen too much. He set down his fork with a clink that echoed through the silent hall. "Bring me the chef." The command slithered through the castle like a cold draught. Bertrand, who had been attempting to hide behind a decorative suit of armor, was extracted by two guards with the enthusiasm of men who had long since run out of patience for foolish chefs. He was deposited at the foot of the king's table like a poorly wrapped gift. The king stared at him. Bertrand stared at the floor. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, as if even it knew how badly this was going. Finally, the king spoke. "Tell me, chef, what exactly were you attempting to accomplish with this meal?" Bertrand swallowed. His mouth tasted like burnt regrets. "Innovation, your majesty." The king's fingers tightened around his goblet. "Innovation, Bedtime, hapless, Yes, you see, any chef can follow a recipe, but it takes true vision to redefine what food can be. "Vision," the king repeated flatly. Bertrand nodded, sweat trickling down his temple. "Exactly. For instance, the tart's firm texture, a commentary on the enduring nature of royal legacy." The king leaned back in his chair. The entire hall held its breath. Then, to everyone's shock, he laughed. It was not a pleasant sound. "I have been served many terrible meals in my time," he mused, "but this is the first one that dared to lecture me." Bertrand braced for the dungeon, or the stocks, or whatever creative punishment royalty favored for culinary crimes. Instead, the king took another deliberate bite of the tart, chewed thoughtfully, and said, "It's awful." Bertrand opened his mouth to apologize, but the king held up a hand. "But it is interestingly awful, and I find myself morbidly curious to see what you will ruin next." A stunned silence settled over the room. Marguerite's grip on her wine glass loosened slightly. The king waved a hand. "You may go, but tomorrow, chef, I expect effort, even if it's futile." Bertrand backed out of the hall, bowing so many times he nearly toppled over. The kitchen staff, who had been listening at the door, scattered as he stumbled back in, their expressions a mix of awe and horror. Gaston clapped him on the shoulder. "You're alive." Claudette shook her head. "I don't understand." Bertrand didn't either. He had served the king a meal that should have gotten him banished, if not beheaded. And yet, he had somehow impossibly survived. Marguerite appeared in the doorway, her lips pursed. "Congratulations. You have managed to fail so spectacularly that it circled back into intrigue." She sighed. "The king has ordered you to prepare breakfast tomorrow. He specifically requested eggs." Bertrand's stomach lurched. Eggs. He had once attempted a simple omelette and produced something that could have been used to risole a boot. As the kitchen staff dispersed, muttering among themselves, Bertrand sank onto a stool and buried his head in his hands. He had no idea what had just happened. He only knew one thing for certain: tomorrow would be worse. Somewhere in the castle, a clock struck midnight. The pigeon, still perched in the rafters, ruffled its feathers smugly. Chapter 4. The King's Peculiar Taste, or Lack Thereof. The kitchens of Castle Glatmond were never silent, not truly. Even in the dead of night, embers glowed in the hearth, and the occasional bubble of a forgotten stew punctuated the darkness like a lazy afterthought. But now, just before dawn, as Bertrand stood hunched over a bowl of eggs, with the focus of a man defusing a bomb, the quiet felt heavier than usual. The staff had given him a wide berth, as though his very presence might cause their ingredients to spontaneously combust. He cracked the first egg. The yolk slid into the pan with a sullen plop. "Don't think about it," muttered Claudette from across the room, where she was sharpening knives with unnecessary violence. "Just cook them." Bertrand thought about it. He thought about every egg he had ever ruined, the rubbery ones, the ones that had fused to the pan like cement, the ones that had somehow emerged both raw and burnt at the same time. His hands shook. The first sign of trouble came when the edges of the eggs began to curl prematurely, like parchment held too close to a flame. Bertrand poked them with a spatula. They hissed in protest. Gaston, who had been lurking near the larder, leaned in. "You're supposed to move them around, gently." "I am moving them gently," Bertrand snapped, scraping aggressively at the pan. "No, that's—" Gaston winced as a chunk of egg stuck to the metal and blackened instantly. "Never mind." By the time Bertrand deemed the eggs finished, they had achieved a texture somewhere between leather and lace. He prodded them with a fork. They did not yield. Marguerite appeared at his elbow, her expression unreadable. "The king has requested you present them yourself." Bertrand's throat went dry. "Why?" "Perhaps he enjoys watching you suffer." She adjusted her sleeve. "Or perhaps he's just bored. Royalty does love a spectacle." The walk to the king's private breakfast chamber was the longest of Bertrand's life. The plate in his hand seemed to grow heavier with every step, the eggs staring up at him like the accusing eyes of his culinary failures. The guards at the door gave him looks that suggested they had already chosen the spot in the courtyard where his head would roll. King Florian was seated at a small table by a window, sunlight glinting off the silverware in a way that felt mocking. He looked up as Bertrand entered, his expression as inscrutable as ever. "Ah, the destroyer of meals." The king gestured to the empty chair across from him. "Disturbing. Is it unnoticed?" Bertrand sat. The chair creaked ominously. The king speared a piece of egg, examined it, and took a bite. Bertrand braced himself. A moment passed, then another. The king chewed slowly, his gaze distant, as though he were contemplating the mysteries of the universe rather than the charcoal-like substance on his fork. Finally, he swallowed. "It's terrible," he announced. Bertrand opened his mouth to apologize, but the king continued. "Last week, my previous chef served me eggs so perfect they were practically insulting. Flawless, symmetrical, boring, dirty." He took another bite. "These at least have character." Bertrand blinked. "Character?" "Chaos," the king corrected. "Unpredictability, a certain je ne sais quoi of disaster." He set down his fork. "Tell me, chef, do you always cook this badly, or are you making a special effort for me?" Bertrand hesitated. "I have been told my talents lie elsewhere." The king snorted. "That's one way to put it." He leaned back in his chair. "You intrigue me. Most chefs tremble at the thought of displeasing me. You seem incapable of doing anything else. It's refreshing." Bertrand wasn't sure whether to be relieved or offended. The king pushed the plate away. "I have a proposition for you. Continue to cook for me. Don't try to ruin the food. I suspect that comes naturally to you. But don't hide it either. Serve me your failures with pride." Bertrand's mind reeled. "You wanting me to burn your meals?" "I want honesty," the king said. "And you, chef, are the most honest cook I've ever met. You can't disguise your incompetence if you try." It was possibly the strangest compliment Bertrand had ever received. The king stood, signaling the end of the audience. "Dinner tonight. I expect something memorably awful." Bertrand returned to the kitchens in a daze. The staff took one look at his face and erupted into questions. "Well?" demanded Gaston. "Are we peeling potatoes for your execution feast?" Bertrand shook his head slowly. He liked it. A stunned silence fell. Claudette's knife slipped, embedding itself in the table. He said. Bertrand swallowed. "He said he wants me to keep cooking for him, exactly as I have been." The kitchen erupted into disbelief. Marguerite, who had been listening from the doorway, folded her arms. "Of course," she said dryly. "The one chef in the kingdom who can't boil water. And the king decides he's a delicacy." Bertrand didn't have an answer. He didn't understand it either. But as the staff returned to their work, muttering about the madness of royalty, he couldn't help but feel a flicker of something unfamiliar. It wasn't quite pride. It wasn't quite relief. But it was something. That evening, as Bertrand set fire to a perfectly good cut of lamb, the king had requested a show. He realized something else, too. For the first time in his life, he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Chapter 5. The Scullion's Conspiracy. The castle kitchens had seen many strange things over the centuries. Ill-advised experiments with exotic spices, drunken brawls between pastry chefs, that one unfortunate incident involving a catapult and a wheel of aged cheese. But never before had they witnessed a chef actively encouraged to fail. The staff didn't know whether to be horrified or impressed. Mostly they were just exhausted. By the third week of Bertrand's reign of culinary terror, the kitchen staff had reached a breaking point. The king might have developed a perverse fondness for charcoal-encrusted meats and soups that could double as mortar. But the rest of the castle was suffering. The servants forced to clean the endlessly blackened pans had developed permanent scowls. The scullions tasked with disposing of the inedible leftovers had taken to muttering darkly about rebellion. Even the castle dogs, usually grateful for scraps, had begun to slink away at the sight of Bertrand approaching with a plate. Something had to be done. The conspiracy began, as most great rebellions do, in the dimly lit corner of the cellar where the kitchen staff stole their moments of respite. The wine barrels made for decent seating, and the rats were at least polite enough not to interrupt. Claudette, her sleeve still flecked with the remains of that morning's tragically over-reduced hollandaise, leaned forward. "We can't go on like this. My knives are dull from scraping off burnt crusts. My wrists ache from whisking sauces back from the brink of disaster. I refuse to spend the rest of my career covering for a man who thinks al dente means still breathing." Gaston, sharpening his cleaver with ominous precision, nodded. "The Butchers' Guild is starting to talk. They think we're doing it on purpose. Next thing you know, we'll be accused of treason via undercooked poultry." A young scullion named Pierre, whose primary job was fishing eggshells out of batters, raised a tentative hand. "What if we fixed his mistakes? Just a little. Not enough for the king to notice, but enough that the food stops tasting like regret." Marguerite, who had been silently sipping a glass of wine that may or may not have been intended for the king's table, set down her cup with a decisive click. "Absolutely not." The room deflated. Marguerite continued, her voice low and measured. "The king has made his preferences clear. He wants Bertrand's disasters. If we start improving the food, we're not just defying the chef. We're defying the crown." She paused. "That said, there's no rule against making the disasters more manageable." A slow grin spread across Gaston's face. "Sabotage, und not sabotage," Marguerite corrected. "Guidance, strategic interference. If Bertrand is going to ruin every meal, we might as well steer the ruin in directions that won't poison anyone." And so the plan was born. The next morning, as Bertrand stared at a pot of boiling water like it had personally betrayed him, Claudette casually swapped his salt for sugar. The resulting broth was bafflingly sweet, but at least it wasn't the usual sodium-laden assault on the palate. When Bertrand attempted to roast a chicken, Gaston accidentally knocked over a jug of brine, ensuring the meat was too waterlogged to fully char. The king, upon cutting into it, remarked that it was almost edible. How disappointing. Pierre, meanwhile, took to discreetly removing the worst of Bertrand's mistakes before they reached the plate. A lump of unidentifiable gristle here, a suspiciously green bit of herb there. Bertrand, oblivious to the conspiracy unfolding around him, began to notice something strange. His meals were still bad, yes, but they were bad in different ways. Less explosively so. The king, though he never complained, seemed faintly disappointed by this development. The tipping point came during the preparation of the king's name-day feast, a meal that traditionally spanned 12 courses and at least 2 nervous breakdowns. Bertrand, tasked with the centerpiece peacock, stuffed, roasted, and arranged in a dramatic display of its own feathers, was sweating into the basting liquid. "I don't understand," he muttered, to no one in particular. "It's supposed to turn golden, not whatever this is." The bird in question was currently a mottled shade of puce, its skin bubbling ominously. Marguerite materialized at his elbow. "Perhaps it's the glaze," she suggested innocently, sliding a bowl of honey-laced vinegar within reach. Bertrand, desperate, poured it over the peacock. The reaction was immediate and violent, a hissing, caramelizing mess that sent up a cloud of fragrant smoke. The kitchen staff exchanged glances. This was either going to be brilliant or catastrophic. When the peacock was presented, its feathers artfully arranged to hide the worst of the damage, the king's eyes lit up. He took one bite, chewed thoughtfully, and declared it delightfully unsettling. The kitchen staff exhaled in collective relief. That night, as they scrubbed the last of the peacock glaze from the pots, Claudette turned to Marguerite. "We're enabling him, you know." Marguerite smirked. "Of course we are, but at least now we're doing it on purpose." And so the uneasy alliance continued, the staff subtly guiding Bertrand's disasters away from true catastrophe, Bertrand remaining blissfully unaware of his own incompetence, and the king enjoying his meals with a perverse satisfaction that no one else could fathom. Somewhere in the rafters, the pigeon watched it all unfold. its beady eyes glittering with something that might have been amusement or indigestion. It was hard to tell. Chapter 6. A feast for the diplomats and their horror. News of King Florian's eccentric taste in chefs had, against all odds, not yet spread beyond the borders of the kingdom. This was about to change in spectacular fashion. The occasion was the annual diplomatic summit, where dignitaries from neighboring realms gathered under the pretense of discussing trade agreements and border disputes, while actually just judging each other's fashion choices and counting the minutes until the wine was served. This year, the honor of hosting fell to Castle Gluckmond, which meant the honor of catering fell to Bertrand. When Marguerite delivered the news, Bertrand's face went the color of week-old porridge. "You can't be serious." Marguerite inspected her nails. "The king was very specific. He wants you to prepare the feast exactly as you would for him. But these are foreign ambassadors. The Grand Envoy of Velskova has a palate so refined he can allegedly taste if the chef was left-handed. Then he'll have a fascinating time with your cooking," Marguerite said dryly. "Do try not to start a war." The kitchen staff, upon learning of their impending doom, immediately launched into emergency measures. Gaston began sharpening every blade in the kitchen, not for cooking, but possibly for self-defense. Claudette started prepping antidotes under the guise of sauces. Even the usually optimistic Pierre began eyeing the servants' exit with renewed interest. Bertrand, meanwhile, paged frantically through cookbooks like a man trying to learn an entire language in an afternoon. "Perhaps if I just follow the instructions exactly." "You never follow the instructions exactly," Gaston pointed out. "You follow them paperwords in a mirror while blindfolded." The day of the feast arrived with the inevitability of a slow-moving avalanche. The great hall had been decorated within an inch of its life. Banners hung, chandeliers polished, floor swept of anything that might suggest the castle's usual state of controlled chaos. The dignitaries filed in, their robes swishing, their noses already lifted in anticipation of culinary mediocrity. Then the first course was served. The Grand Envoy of Velskova took one bite of the amuse-bouche, a delicate puff pastry that Bertrand had somehow transformed into a dense, chewy mystery, and his left eye began to twitch. "This is an interesting texture," he managed. The ambassador from the northern reaches prodded her soup cautiously, as if it might bite back. "Is the gray color traditional?" King Florian, seated at the head of the table, beamed. "Our chef has a very modern approach. Do try the foam. It's meant to evoke the sensation of biting into a cloud." The foam in question, a sad puddle of what had once been an herb emulsion, bubbled ominously. Course after course, the horror unfolded. The fish course was served so underdone that the envoy from the Coastal Alliance swore she saw a gill flutter. The meat course arrived encased in a crust so thick the ambassadors had to chip at it with their knives. The cheese platter included a variety that had been left to age just a hair too long, resulting in an aroma that cleared the sinuses of everyone within a 10-foot radius. Through it all, King Florian ate with relish, complimenting each dish as if Bertrand had reinvented cuisine itself. The kitchen staff, peeking through the serving doors, watched the unfolding disaster with a mix of awe and existential dread. Then came the dessert. Bertrand had attempted a grand finale, a towering chocolate sculpture meant to represent the unity of the realms. What emerged from the kitchen looked less like a symbol of peace and more like a small angry volcano. The chocolate had seized. The caramel had crystallized. The decorative sugarwork had melted into what appeared to be a very abstract interpretation of a battlefield. The silence that followed the presentation was the loudest thing Bertrand had ever heard. Finally, the Grand Orange set down his fork with deliberate care. "Your Majesty," he said slowly, "this has been an educational meal." King Florian dabbed his lips with a napkin. "I'm so glad you enjoyed it." The ambassador from the northern reaches stood abruptly. "I believe I have developed a sudden allergy to this country." She strode from the hall, her retinue scrambling after her. One by one, the other dignitaries made their excuses. Urgent correspondence to attend to, unexpected illnesses, a pressing need to be literally anywhere else. Within minutes the hall was nearly empty. King Florian sighed contentedly and reached for another helping of the chocolate monstrosity. A resounding success, don't you think? Marguerite, who had been standing stiffly against the wall, closed her eyes briefly. At least they didn't declare war on the spot. Back in the kitchen, Bertrand sat slumped on a stool, staring into the middle distance. The staff moved around him in silence, unsure whether to offer comfort or a blindfold for the inevitable execution. Claudette finally broke the silence. On the bright side, no one will ever ask us to host a diplomatic summit again. Gaston nodded. And we've probably invented several new forms of food-based warfare. Bertrand groaned and buried his face in his hands. I've ruined international relations. Pierre patted his shoulder. Look at it this way. You've given them something to bond over. Mutual trauma is the foundation of many great alliances. Somewhere above them, the pigeon cooed softly, as if laughing. The next morning, a letter arrived from the Grand Envoy of Velskova. King Florian read it aloud at breakfast with delight. Your chef's unique talents have given us much to discuss. In light of this experience, we propose an immediate reduction in tariffs on imported spices, for the good of all our peoples. Marguerite pinched the bridge of her nose. They're trying to bribe us into never cooking for them again. The king smiled. See, Bertrand? You're a diplomatic genius. Bertrand, who had been nervously attempting to poach an egg and failing spectacularly, didn't look up. I hate my life. And in the kitchens of Castle Glutmond, business as usual resumed. Chapter 7. The Secret Midnight Snacks. It began with a missing carrot. Bertrand had been in the middle of composing yet another culinary disaster. This time a poached pear that had somehow taken on the texture of wet parchment. When he noticed the anomaly, the vegetable bins, usually meticulously organized by Claudette, showed clear signs of disturbance. A handful of radishes had vanished. A cabbage bore the unmistakable marks of having been gnawed at the edges, like some feral beast had gotten to it. He mentioned it to Gaston the next morning. The butcher barely glanced up from his cleaver. Probably rats, big ones, the kind that wear crowns and have terrible taste in chefs. Bertrand dismissed the joke, until 3 nights later when he found himself wandering back to the kitchens in the dead of night, unable to sleep. The castle was quiet, the stones holding their breath in that peculiar way they did when no one was meant to be awake. Then he heard it, the unmistakable crunch of someone eating something decidedly raw. First babes you. He followed the sound to the pantry, where a single candle flickered, casting long shadows. And there, hunched over a basket of turnips like a guilty raccoon, was King Florian. The monarch froze mid-bite, a half-chewed root vegetable protruding from his mouth. For a long moment, the two men simply stared at one another. Bertrand should have bowed, or apologized, or possibly fainted. Instead, he heard himself say, "You, like turnips." The king swallowed with some difficulty. They're adequately crunchy. Another silence. The candle guttered. Bertrand's mind raced. This explained so much. The king's bizarre tolerance for terrible food. His insistence on keeping Bertrand employed despite all reason. The man had been secretly supplementing his diet with whatever hadn't yet been ruined by cooking. King Florian brushed a stray bit of turnip green from his nightshirt, trying and failing to regain his usual regal composure. You're wondering why I don't simply have you replaced. I hadn't gotten that far in my thoughts, Your Majesty. The king sighed and sat down on a sack of flour, suddenly looking less like a monarch and more like a very tired man who really wanted to finish his clandestine snack. Do you know how exhausting it is to be king? Bertrand, who could barely manage being a chef, shook his head. Every decision questioned, every move scrutinized. Every meal an elaborate performance where the wrong fork could spark rumors of instability. The king picked up a raw carrot and gestured with it. But you're magnificently, reliably terrible. There's no pretense, no politics. Just honest incompetence. He took a savage bite of the carrot. It's refreshing. Bertrand wasn't sure whether to be insulted or touched. And then the king continued with his mouth full. There's the side benefit. Side benefit? King Florian leaned forward conspiratorially. Since you took over, no one expects me to host elaborate state dinners anymore. The trade delegation from Carinthia stayed exactly one meal before concluding their business in record time. The Duke of Marbury cancelled his annual month-long visit, entirely after hearing about the diplomatic incident with the peacock. The king smiled beatifically. You've given me the gift of time, Bertrand. Glorious, peaceful time. Outside, an owl hooted. Somewhere in the castle walls, a mouse scuttled. Bertrand considered this revelation. So when you praise my food, I'm praising exactly what it is. A weapon of mass repulsion. The king stood, brushing flour from his nightshirt. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a date with that head of lettuce before the kitchen staff wakes up. As the king slipped back into the shadows, carrot tops trailing from his pocket, Bertrand sat down heavily on the flour sack. All this time, he'd thought he was failing upward by sheer luck. Turns out he'd been succeeding spectacularly at something entirely different. The next morning, Claudette noticed the new teeth marks in the butter. Bigger rats this time, Gaston observed. Bertrand just smiled and reached for the salt, the real salt, not the sugar he'd accidentally used in 3 previous dishes. You know, he mused, I think I'm finally starting to understand this job. And for the first time since arriving at Castle Glutmond, he didn't burn the breakfast. Not on purpose, anyway. Some habits, it seemed, were harder to break than others. Chapter 8. The Royal Food Taster's Dilemma. Lady Marguerite de Crème had faced many challenges in her tenure as the Royal Food Taster. Attempted poisonings, ill-advised culinary experiments. That one summer when the castle cooks became briefly obsessed with edible gold leaf. But nothing could have prepared her for Bertrand. Her mornings now began with the same silent prayer. Let it be something recognizably food today. This particular morning, the dish in question was what Bertrand proudly called a sunrise-inspired omelette, though it more closely resembled something scraped from the bottom of a pond. The edges were blackened. The center quivered ominously. The herbs, sprinkled on top, looked suspiciously like the ones growing between the cobblestones in the courtyard. Marguerite raised her fork with the solemnity of a woman preparing for battle. Across the table, Bertrand watched with the eager expression of a puppy who had just presented its owner with a dead bird. The first bite was worse than expected, which was saying something. The eggs had achieved that peculiar state of being simultaneously rubbery and runny. The herbs tasted distinctly of dirt. And was that a piece of eggshell? Marguerite's eye twitched. Interesting. Texture. Bertrand beamed. I added crushed almonds for crunch. Those aren't almonds, aren't they? Marguerite took a long sip of wine, wishing it was something stronger. She had survived 23 assassination attempts in her career, but Bertrand's cooking might finally do her in. That afternoon, she cornered Claudette near the spice racks. There must be a way to make his food less lethal without actually improving it. Claudette snorted. You're asking for a miracle. Just something to take the edge off. The king may enjoy his near-death culinary experiences, but my stomach has limits. Thus began Marguerite's campaign of subtle sabotage. When Bertrand wasn't looking, she would dash vinegar into oversalted soups. She smuggled fresh herbs to replace his questionable foraging attempts. On one memorable occasion, she managed to swap out a suspicious-looking pâté with a nearly identical one prepared by Gaston, the main difference being that Gaston's version didn't threaten to walk off the plate. Her greatest innovation, however, was the strategic use of distractions. A well-timed drop napkin could disguise a spit-out bite. A sudden coughing fit covered the dumping of an entire tureen into a potted plant. The plant died 3 days later, which Marguerite took as a personal failure. Bertrand, oblivious to these maneuvers, began to notice that his dishes were being met with fewer expressions of outright horror. He took this as a sign of improvement. "You know," he told Pierre one evening as they surveyed a particularly questionable fish course, "I think I'm getting the hang of this." Pierre, who had seen Marguerite feed most of that same fish to the castle cats under the table, nodded vigorously. "Oh yes, chef, much better." The system worked beautifully until the night of the royal banquet for the visiting Count of Umbria. Marguerite, having successfully avoided eating most of the first 3 courses through a combination of strategic napkin use and feigned swooning, found herself face to face with Bertrand's pièce de résistance, a towering dessert he called chocolate oblivion. It was, without exaggeration, the single most terrifying thing she had ever seen on a plate. The chocolate had separated into oily pools. The garnish appeared to be actual cinders. The whole structure leaned at an angle that defied physics and good sense. King Florian clapped his hands in delight. Marvelous! Marguerite's fork hovered over the monstrosity. For the first time in her career, she considered feigning her own death. Then inspiration struck. "Your Majesty," she said, rising gracefully, "before we indulge, might I suggest the traditional Umbrian tasting ritual? It would honor our guest." The Count, who had been eyeing the dessert with growing alarm, brightened. "Yes, absolutely. Very important tradition," Marguerite continued. "The taster must be blindfolded, the better to focus on the pure flavors." Within minutes she found herself seated at the head of the table, a silk scarf tied over her eyes. The blindfold, naturally, had a very convenient gap at the bottom. As the Count droned on about Umbrian customs, Marguerite discreetly fed the chocolate to the king's ever-patient hunting dog under the table. The dog, to its credit, ate the entire thing without complaint, though it did spend the next hour licking its own paws with unusual desperation. "Astonishing depth of flavor," Marguerite announced to applause. Later that night, as she soaked her feet in a basin of cool water, a precaution after what the chocolate had done to the dog, she reflected on her new reality. She had trained her entire life to detect subtle poisons, to navigate the delicate politics of palace cuisine, to keep her monarch safe from culinary harm. Never had she imagined her greatest enemy would be an enthusiastic incompetent. Somewhere in the castle, Bertrand was probably setting something on fire. Marguerite poured herself another glass of wine. She was going to need it. Chapter 9. The Great Kitchen Fire of 23. The morning had begun like any other in Castle Gluckmann's kitchens, with the clatter of pans, the hiss of something burning prematurely, and the general air of impending disaster that followed Bertrand like a particularly devoted shadow. Today's experiment was a flambé, a technique Bertrand had read about in a stolen cookbook, and decided to attempt despite no one in the kitchen being entirely certain what the word meant. "It means to flame," Bertrand explained to the skeptical staff, waving the book with the enthusiasm of a man about to make a terrible decision. Gaston squinted at the recipe. "It also says to use brandy, not lamp oil. Same principle." Marguerite, who had been pretending to inspect the wine cellar for the past hour to avoid breakfast duty, chose that moment to emerge. She took one look at the setup, Bertrand holding a jug of highly questionable liquor, Claudette edging toward the exit, Pierre already wearing a makeshift damp cloth over his nose and mouth, and immediately turned back around. "I forgot to count the corks." The first attempt went about as well as one might expect. The moment the liquor hit the pan, a fireball erupted with the enthusiasm of a dragon waking from a nap. The hanging pots rattled ominously. Several aprons burst into incidental flames. The pigeon, who had seen enough of Bertrand's experiments to develop survival instincts, immediately evacuated to the rafters. "Perhaps less next time," Pierre squeaked from behind his cloth mask. Bertrand, undeterred, adjusted his chef's hat, now smoldering slightly at the brim, and poured again. This time, the flames leapt straight up the wall, licking at the centuries-old grease stains like they were a delicacy. A tapestry depicting King Florian's great-grandfather hunting a boar suddenly found itself playing the role of kindling. Claudette grabbed the nearest bucket of liquid, which tragically turned out to be cooking oil, and threw it on the flames. The resulting fireball could probably have been seen from neighboring kingdoms. Somewhere in the chaos, Gaston bellowed, "Evacuate," with the voice of a man who had been waiting his entire life to say that word properly. The staff poured into the courtyard in a cloud of smoke and charred dignity. Guards came running, their armor clanking, only to stop short at the sight of the kitchen windows belching flames like an over-enthusiastic bakery. The castle's fire brigade, 3 men and a very confused goat, arrived and immediately began arguing about hose directions. Through it all, King Florian emerged onto his balcony, still in his nightcap, squinting at the commotion. He took in the scene. The smoke, the screaming, Bertrand standing sheepishly with a blackened spoon still in hand. The king sighed. Is there any bread that survived? By noon the fire had been contained to just the kitchen, and part of the adjacent scullery, and a bit of the larder. The royal court stood in the courtyard, covered in soot and existential dread, while the king buttered a slightly singed roll with what might have been excessive calm. Marguerite, whose eyebrows had been partially singed off, addressed Bertrand with terrifying quiet. "Explain." Bertrand held up the cookbook, now more ash than paper. "In my defense, the instructions were unclear. The illustration clearly shows a small controlled flame," Gaston growled. "Not the fiery wrath of an angry god." King Florian licked a bit of jam from his fingers. "I rather liked the spectacle. We should do it again sometime." Every member of the kitchen staff turned to stare at their monarch with varying degrees of horror. The king, either oblivious or deliberately obtuse, continued. "Perhaps next time without the actual fire, though. The smoke does terrible things to my sinuses." As the staff began the long process of assessing the damage, the ovens were now abstract art. The spice racks were now one homogeneous flavor, and the hanging copper pots had fused into a single ominous bell-like structure. Bertrand found himself oddly optimistic. Sure, he'd nearly destroyed the castle. True, he might have accidentally invented a new form of warfare. But no one could say his cooking lacked excitement. That evening, as the royal household dined on bread, cheese, and whatever vegetables had been rescued from the larder, eaten raw, at the king's pointed suggestion, an envoy arrived from the neighboring kingdom of Ispara. The man took in the soot-stained faces, the smell of smoke still clinging to everything, the general air of exhaustion, and cleared his throat. "We come bearing gifts from our king's kitchens in this time of difficulty." The gifts turned out to be several crates of preserved meats, pickled vegetables, and, most tellingly, 5 fully cooked roast chickens. The message was clear. Even rival kingdoms had taken pity on them. King Florian, happily tearing into a chicken leg, nodded to Bertrand. "See? Your reputation precedes you." Bertrand wasn't sure whether to be proud or terrified. Given his track record, he settled for both. As night fell and the castle's inhabitants bedded down in whatever rooms weren't full of smoke, Bertrand lay awake staring at the ceiling. Tomorrow would bring the daunting task of rebuilding the kitchen. There would be reprimands. There would be lectures. There might even be, heaven forbid, safety protocols. But for tonight, there was the comforting knowledge that no matter how badly things went, he could always fall back on his greatest talent, making people appreciate the simple things in life. Like bread, and not being on fire. Somewhere in the distance, the pigeon coughed. Chapter 10. The Queen's Silent Judgment. The Queen of Glutmond had not spoken a word about Bertrand's cooking. Not when the roast pheasant arrived looking like it had lost a duel with a blacksmith's forge. Not when the soup developed an unsettling skin that resembled pond scum. Not even when the infamous chocolate oblivion had made the hunting dog whimper for 2 days straight. Her silence was more terrifying than any complaint. Queen Maribel the Aesthetic, as she was known, possessed a gift for conveying entire speeches with nothing more than the arch of an eyebrow. Born into a family of renowned Epicureans, she could supposedly discern a chef's entire lineage from a single bite of sauce. Her cookbook collection was legendary, her palate refined to the point of absurdity, and her patience for culinary incompetence non-existent, which made her utter silence on the subject of Bertrand's food all the more unnerving. The staff noticed first, when Bertrand's latest interpretation of trout amandine, which involved neither trout nor almonds, but did feature an alarming amount of what appeared to be candle wax, was presented at dinner, the Queen simply set down her fork with a click that echoed through the hall. She dabbed her lips precisely 3 times with her napkin. Then she turned her gaze, that famous ice-blue, soul-withering gaze, first to the plate, then to Bertrand, then finally to her husband, who was happily mashing the fish into something resembling mortar. The temperature in the room dropped several degrees. "She hates it," Claudette whispered in the kitchens afterward, shuddering. "But she didn't say anything," Pierre pointed out. Gaston sharpened his cleaver with unnecessary vigor. "That's how you know it's bad. When the Queen stops complaining, start digging your grave." Bertrand, who had been nervously chewing on his own sleeve, made the mistake of trying to improve. The next day, he presented what he considered his magnum opus, a delicate puff pastry filled with mushrooms, and what he hoped was some variety of edible cream. The Queen took one look at the lopsided creation, its oozing contents, its suspicious gray hue, and did something unprecedented. She pushed the plate gently but firmly toward the center of the table, folded her hands in her lap, and did not eat for the remainder of the meal. King Florian, mouth full of pastry, blinked at his wife. "Not hungry, my dear." The Queen smiled. It was the most terrifying expression Bertrand had ever witnessed. That night, Bertrand found himself standing outside the Queen's private chambers, summoned by a note delivered via a very nervous page boy. The door opened before he could knock, revealing the Queen's personal attendant, a woman who looked like she'd been weaned on vinegar and disappointment. The Queen's sitting room was everything Bertrand was not. Elegant, refined, and free of suspicious stains. Her Majesty sat by the fire, a book of illuminated herbals open in her lap. She did not look up when he entered. Bertrand bowed so low his nose nearly brushed the floor. "Your Majesty wished to?" "I did not." The Queen turned a page with deliberate care. "But it seems we must speak." Bertrand's stomach attempted to climb into his throat. Still without looking at him, the Queen continued. "Do you know why I have never commented on your creations? Because they're beneath notice?" Bertrand ventured weakly. "Because," the Queen said, finally lifting her gaze, "my husband hasn't enjoyed his meals this much since he was a boy, stealing jam tarts from the kitchens." She closed the book with a snap. "The man has spent his entire life choking down perfectly seasoned, exquisitely presented dishes that brought him no joy. Until you." Bertrand opened his mouth. Closed it. "The day you served that abomination you called deconstructed tart," he laughed for the first time at dinner in 15 years. The Queen's expression softened, just slightly. "So you will continue to cook, as you do, and I will continue to not eat it. This is our arrangement." She picked up a small bell and rang it once, dismissing him. As Bertrand backed toward the door, the Queen added, almost as an afterthought, "But if you ever serve me another foam, I cannot be held responsible for my actions." Bertrand spent the walk back to the kitchens in a daze. He had expected to be fired, or possibly stabbed. Instead, he'd been given what might have been the closest thing to royal approval he'd ever received. The next morning, as he prepared breakfast, a process that involved mostly guessing and prayer, he noticed the Queen's personal maid waiting near the service entrance. The woman wordlessly handed him a package wrapped in plain linen. Inside was a single pristine cookbook, the Queen's personal copy of The Art of Subtle Flavors by the famous chef Alain de Monet. The inscription on the first page read, "IK4, reference only. Do not attempt." Diplomats. Bertrand grinned. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't approval. But it was something. That evening he served the king a spectacularly burnt custard with pride. The Queen, as promised, did not touch hers. But Bertrand could have sworn he saw the corner of her mouth twitch when the king declared it delightfully catastrophic. And in the kitchens of Castle Glatmond, life, chaotic, smoky, and strangely wonderful, went on. Chapter 11. The chef's one successful dish by accident. The day began like any other in the kitchens of Castle Glatmond, with chaos, confusion, and the smell of something burning that really shouldn't be. Bertrand stood over a pot of what was theoretically supposed to become a velouté sauce, stirring with the grim determination of a man who knew disaster was inevitable, but refused to go down without a fight. This time, however, fate intervened in the form of a distracted scullion named Pierre, who knocked over an unmarked jar of herbs directly into the pot. Before Bertrand could react, Claudette, thinking quickly, dumped in a pitcher of cream to balance the flavors. Gaston, passing by with a haunch of meat, added a splash of wine for good measure. The resulting concoction bubbled ominously, producing an aroma that was suspiciously pleasant. Bertrand stared at the pot. The pot, against all odds, did not stare back with malice. "This might actually be edible," he said, voicing the dangerous thought aloud. The kitchen staff froze. Such words had never been uttered in these halls before. Even the fire in the hearth seemed to burn quieter in reverence. Marguerite, ever the pragmatist, was first to break the silence. "Don't get cocky. It probably just forgot to be terrible." But as the sauce thickened and the herbs melded, it became clear that something miraculous had occurred. The color was right. The consistency was perfect. The taste, when Bertrand finally worked up the courage to try it, was undeniably good. Panic set in. "What do we do?" Pierre whispered, as if speaking too loud might break the spell. "We serve it, obviously," Gaston said, already carving slices of bread for dipping. Claudette shook her head. "The king expects Bertrand's cooking to be awful. What if he thinks we're mocking him?" While the cooks debated, the solution presented itself in the form of a harried servant rushing in with news. The king had abruptly ridden out to settle a border dispute, and wouldn't return until supper. The queen was taking her meal in her chambers. The only ones left to feed were the castle staff. Marguerite looked from the perfect sauce to Bertrand's bewildered face and made an executive decision. "We'll serve it in the servants' hall. No one will ever know." And so Bertrand's one flawless creation, a rich, herbed cream sauce that would have made the Queen's own chefs weep with envy, was poured unceremoniously over day-old bread in the castle's underground dining hall. The scullions and stable hands devoured it with gusto, unaware they were eating what might have been the palace's greatest culinary achievement. Upstairs, the king returned to find Bertrand waiting with that evening's offering, a reimagined pigeon pie that had somehow fused to its dish. Florian beamed as he pried a chunk free with his dagger. "Marvelous! It's like eating pottery." Later that night, as Bertrand sat alone in the kitchens, staring at the empty saucepot, Pierre hesitantly approached. "It was good, chef, really good." Bertrand sighed. "And no one will ever believe I made it." The next morning, rumors spread through the servant ranks about a mysterious heavenly sauce. Some said it was prepared by a traveling gourmet. Others claimed the ghost of the castle's first cook had blessed their meal. Bertrand listened to the speculation with quiet amusement as he gleefully burned the breakfast sausages beyond recognition. The universe had righted itself. The natural order was restored. and somewhere in the pantry the pigeon cooed what might have been a laugh. After all, what's one perfect dish when you've built an entire career on glorious failure? Chapter 12. The Palace Dog's Feast. The royal kennels had never been particularly discerning when it came to cuisine. The hounds of Castle Glutmond, bred for generations to track boar and endure the king's occasionally questionable hunting instincts, were known to eat anything that fit in their mouths, including, on one memorable occasion, a footman's boot. But even by their standards, their newfound devotion to Bertrand's cooking was remarkable. It began with the mastiff, Brutus. The massive beast, who usually regarded food with the same enthusiasm most dogs reserve for baths, caught scent of one of Bertrand's failed beef joints, charred black on the outside, stubbornly raw within, and nearly knocked over a scullion in his haste to claim it. He devoured the entire thing in 3 gulps, licked the stone floor clean, then sat by the kitchen door, with an expression of rapturous anticipation usually reserved for mating season. Within days, the entire pack had become devoted followers of Bertrand's culinary disasters. Where others saw inedible ruin, the royal hounds saw gourmet delights. A collapsed soufflé that even the castle pigs had rejected disappeared in seconds. Oversalted gravy was lapped up with tails wagging. The dogs developed a particular fondness for Bertrand's signature charcoal crust, which they crunched with the reverence of connoisseurs savoring fine pastry. The kitchen staff took notice. "They're like living trash compactors," marveled Pierre, watching the pack devour a botched bread pudding that had fused to its dish. Marguerite, ever practical, saw opportunity. "At least someone's enjoying his cooking. Let's make it official." Thus began the unspoken arrangement. Whatever dishes proved too disastrous for human consumption, which was most of them, would be quietly redirected to the kennels. The dogs, in turn, became Bertrand's most vocal, if slobbery, supporters. They trailed after him through the kitchens, noses twitching, tongues lolling in anticipation. Brutus took to sleeping outside the pantry, just in case. The king, upon discovering this development during an impromptu kennel visit, was delighted. "Brutus hasn't been this lively since he ate that Diplomats hat," he observed, scratching the mastiff behind the ears. "You found your calling, Bertrand, royal canine chef." Bertrand wasn't sure whether to be flattered or mortified. On one paw, it was nice to have appreciative customers. On the other, his sole culinary admirers drooled on his shoes. The arrangement might have continued indefinitely had the Queen's prized greyhound, Duchess, not gotten wind of the secret menu. The normally refined creature, bred for elegance and speed, abandoned all dignity upon tasting one of Bertrand's seared salmon scraps. Soon she could be found loitering near the kitchens at all hours, her sleek body quivering with anticipation, her aristocratic nose twitching at every whiff of smoke. The Queen, upon finding her champion race a belly up in the kennels among common hunting dogs, a piece of burnt pork belly clutched in her delicate paws, fixed Bertrand with a look that could have frozen the castle moat. Yet even she could not argue with results. Duchess had never had a shinier coat. By month's end, the royal kennels had become the best fed in the kingdom. The dogs grew round and glossy, their coats shining, their energy boundless. The castle's rat population, deprived of their usual kitchen scraps, dwindled to nothing. Even the temperamental castle cats, who had previously regarded Bertrand's offerings with feline disdain, could occasionally be seen slinking into the kennels for a taste. Bertrand, for his part, found unexpected satisfaction in his new role. There was something pure about cooking for creatures that judged solely on enthusiasm, not presentation. That didn't care if a sauce split or a crust burned, so long as the flavor pleased their unrefined palates. As winter set in and the castle's human inhabitants grumbled over yet another season of questionable banquets, the royal hounds could be found sprawled before the kitchen fires, bellies full, dreaming doubtless of tomorrow's burnt offerings. Brutus, in a particular show of devotion, had taken to carrying Bertrand's apron around like a prized trophy, and in the rafters the pigeon watched it all with beady-eyed contemplation, perhaps wondering if it too should abandon its dignity and join the feast. For in the end, every artist needs an appreciative audience, even if that audience drools on the floor and occasionally eats the napkins. Chapter 13. The Jester's Roasts, Literally and Figuratively. The court jester, known to the castle simply as Rattlebones, had been searching for new material. His usual repertoire of bawdy songs and jabs at the nobility had grown stale, his bells jingling to ever politer applause. But when Bertrand arrived at Castle Glatmond, Rattlebones found his muse, one that came with its own smoke signals. It began innocently enough. A passing quip about the interesting texture of Bertrand's bread during a feast. A playful comparison between the chef's roasted meats and the castle's roofing tiles. But as Bertrand's disasters grew more spectacular, so too did Rattlebones' repertoire. By month's end, the jester had developed an entire act dedicated to roasting the royal chef, both verbally and, on one memorable occasion, literally, when he produced a blackened loaf from his sleeve and beat it against the table like a drum. The secret, Rattlebones confided to the court during one performance, is that Chef Bertrand doesn't use recipes. He uses prophecies, and lo, the chicken shall be as charcoal, and the sauce shall separate unto the 4th generation. The court howled. Even the queen hid a smile behind her goblet. Bertrand, serving at the high table, felt his ears burn as Rattlebones launched into a song titled Ode to a Burnt Offering, set to the tune of a popular drinking ballad. Oh, gather round and lend your tongues. Go sing of me's most tragic. Your chef could turn the finest cuts. Go, something quite magic. Note with skill or with art. Bought with flames uncontrolled. We'd rather eat royal hounds. Come, what's on this cold plate of... Marguerite mercifully knocked over a wine pitcher before the final rhyme. The worst came during the midsummer banquet, when Rattlebones appeared dressed in a makeshift chef's costume, complete with a pot for a hat and a wooden spoon crossed with a fire poker. His feast sketch involved attempting to cook an imaginary meal, while progressively catching more of himself on fire, culminating in him extinguishing the flames with a bucket of confetti that rained down over the king's head. King Florian laughed so hard he had to be patted on the back. Bertrand seriously considered throwing himself into the moat. The kitchen staff, at least, showed some sympathy. Don't take it personal, Gaston advised, sharpening his knives with more vigor than strictly necessary. Before you came, he was doing puppet shows about tax policy. Claudette nodded. And look on the bright side. Thanks to you, none of us are ever the butt of the jokes anymore. Pierre, ever the optimist, pointed out, and Rattlebones did get us that extra barrel of cider from the cellars after his last show. Said it was hush payment. Bertrand found little comfort in this. He'd always known his cooking was terrible, but having it celebrated in verse was another matter entirely. The breaking point came when he overheard two scullions singing one of Rattlebones' catcher tunes while scrubbing pots. The king, he asks for tender meat. Yet queen requests it mild. But what arrives upon their plate? King? Ah, leathery, charred. Bertrand slammed the kitchen door hard enough to rattle the pans. That night, as he gloomily stared into a pot of what was meant to be tomorrow's soup starter and currently resembled swamp sediment, inspiration struck. If Rattlebones wanted material, Bertrand would give him material. The next evening's feast began normally enough. Rattlebones was in the middle of his now routine Chef Bertrand's cookbook bit, flipping through an imaginary tome with increasingly outlandish recipe titles, how to make water regret boiling, when the kitchen doors burst open in a cloud of smoke. Bertrand himself emerged, bearing a platter with something that resembled food only in the loosest sense. The creation, a towering, lopsided, shuddering mass, had at least 7 distinct colors, none found in nature. It emitted a low, hissing sound. The court fell silent. "Your Majesty," Bertrand announced with grave ceremony, "I present tonight's masterpiece, surprise en casserole." He set the platter down with a thunk that made several nobles flinch. The surprise turned out to be that the dish was, in fact, still moving slightly. Rattlebones, for once, was speechless. King Florian, after a moment of awed contemplation, burst into applause. "Magnificent! It's like you've outdone yourself by not doing anything at all." The Queen, with impeccable timing, produced a fan and began waving away the suspicious fumes. Rattlebones looked from the dish to Bertrand, then back again. Slowly, a grin spread across his face. He bowed deeply to the chef. The next night, the Jester debuted a new act, one praising Bertrand's avant-garde approach to cuisine. The court laughed, the king cheered, and Bertrand, for the first time, found himself smiling along. After all, there were worse things than being the court's favorite punchline. At least, they remembered his name. And in the rafters, the pigeon cooed what might have been approval, or possibly just indigestion from sampling yesterday's failed hollandaise. The dogs, as always, waited patiently by the kitchen door, ever hopeful. Chapter 14. The Mysterious Disappearance of Spices. The crime was discovered at dawn by Pierre, whose morning duty included unlocking the spice cabinets and counting their precious contents. When he turned the key and swung open the ornate wooden doors, he found only hollow shelves staring back at him like a series of gaping mouths. Not a single peppercorn remained. The saffron, worth its weight in gold, had vanished without a trace. Even the common salt cellar stood empty, its porcelain interior gleaming mockingly in the morning light. Pierre's scream brought the entire kitchen staff running. Claudette was the first to assess the damage, her face paling as she ran a finger along the barren shelves. "This isn't ordinary theft, this is surgical precision." Gaston gripped his cleaver with murderous intent. "No one takes my smoked paprika and lives." Marguerite arrived last, still tying her apron strings. She took one look at the cabinets and fixed Bertrand with an accusatory stare. "Well, what did you do with them?" Bertrand threw up his hands. "Why does everyone assume it's me?" "Because yesterday you used cinnamon instead of cumin in the stew," Pierre pointed out. "And the day before that you confused sugar for salt in the royal porridge," Claudette added. Gaston nodded. "And let's not forget the great nutmeg incident." Bertrand opened his mouth to protest, then closed it. They had a point. The kitchen fell into a tense silence as the magnitude of the situation settled over them. No spices meant no way to mask the natural flavors of their ingredients. No way to correct mistakes. No way to... Marguerite's eyes widened in sudden realization. Bertrand will be cooking completely unseasoned food. A collective shudder ran through the staff. The thought was more terrifying than any band of spice thieves. Rumors spread through the castle like butter on hot bread. The stable boys swore they'd seen shadowy figures carrying sacks toward the moat. The chambermaids whispered about a black market spice ring operating in the cellars. The Queen's greyhound was briefly suspected after being found with a mouthful of something suspiciously yellow, though it turned out to be pollen. King Florian, when informed of the crisis during breakfast, merely shrugged and bit into a conspicuously bland piece of toast. "Perhaps it's for the best. That last peppermill you used nearly took out one of my molars." As the day progressed without answers, the kitchen staff implemented emergency measures. Claudette organized foraging parties to gather wild herbs from the castle gardens. Gaston attempted to smoke his own paprika using questionable methods that left the courtyard hazy for hours. Pierre was put in charge of guarding their meager remaining supplies, 3 cloves of garlic and a very old bay leaf, like a tiny, nervous dragon. Bertrand, meanwhile, faced the unprecedented challenge of cooking without a single spice at his disposal. His first attempt, a plain roasted chicken, emerged from the oven looking suspiciously edible. The staff gathered around it with expressions of wary awe. It's not terrible, Claudette admitted after a cautious bite. Gaston chewed thoughtfully. Almost tastes like chicken. Marguerite's eye twitched. This is worse than I imagined. The real crisis came at dinner service. The king took one bite of his unseasoned pork chop and frowned. Something's different. Bertrand held his breath. King Florian took another bite, then another, his brow furrowing deeper with each chew. Finally, he set down his fork with a disappointed sigh. It's missing that certain Bertrandian flair. Behind the kitchen doors, the staff exchanged panicked looks. Their terrible chef's terrible cooking had become an expected, almost comforting constant. Without his signature spice-related disasters, the very fabric of castle life seemed at risk. That night, as Bertrand lay awake staring at the ceiling, a soft scratching came at his chamber door. He opened it to find the castle dog sitting in a neat row, Brutus at the front with something clamped gently in his jaws, a small linen sack that smelled unmistakably of cumin. One by one the dogs deposited their stolen goods at his feet. Bundles of thyme, packets of peppercorns, even the queen's prized saffron wrapped carefully in parchment. The final reveal came when Duchess dropped a familiar-looking wooden spoon at Bertrand's feet, one that had last been seen in Rattlebone's possession during his chef parody act. The next morning, the spices miraculously reappeared in their cabinets, slightly dog-slobbered but otherwise intact. No one mentioned their return. No one asked questions. And when Bertrand proudly presented that evening's spice-rubbed boar, which somehow managed to be both over-seasoned and bland simultaneously, the entire kitchen staff breathed a sigh of relief. The natural order had been restored. The dogs received extra scraps. And Rattlebones, for reasons he refused to explain, developed a sudden fear of the castle hounds that lasted well into the next season. As for the queen's saffron, well, some mysteries were best left unsolved, especially when the alternative was confronting the fact that the royal dogs had better culinary judgment than the entire court combined. Chapter 15. The Chef's Existential Crisis. It began, as most great revelations do, with a burnt custard. Bertrand stood over the smoking remains of what should have been a simple dessert, watching the edges curl into blackened parchment. The kitchen staff had long since stopped reacting to these minor disasters, continuing their work around him with the practiced indifference of soldiers marching past a familiar ruin. But this time, something was different. As Bertrand poked at the charred surface with a wooden spoon, a troubling thought wormed its way into his mind. What if he wasn't failing? The idea was absurd, of course. He knew his cooking was terrible. The evidence surrounded him daily. The ruined meals, the horrified diners, the dogs that had grown fat on his mistakes. And yet the king kept him employed. The dogs adored his creations. The kitchen staff, despite their grumbling, had developed a strange pride in their shared disasters. Even the queen's silent judgment had taken on the quality of a reluctant spectator at a particularly fascinating train wreck. What if, and this was the truly dangerous thought, what if his food wasn't bad, but revolutionary? Bertrand abandoned the custard and began pacing the kitchen, nearly tripping over Brutus, who had taken to following him like a furry, drooping shadow. Think about it, he muttered to the disinterested mastiff. All those so-called great chefs with their perfect sauces and flawless roasts, where's the excitement? Where's the surprise? He gestured wildly with a ladle. Food should be predictable, Brutus. It should be an adventure. The dog licked his chops in agreement, eyeing the ruined custard with undisguised longing. Claudette, passing by with a tray of mercifully unscathed pastries, paused to watch Bertrand's manic pacing. Are you arguing with yourself again? I'm having an epiphany, Bertrand declared. What if my cooking isn't bad? What if it's avant-garde? Gaston, elbow deep in a side of beef, snorted. Avant-garde is just French for, we'll charge you extra for poorly plated food. But the seed had been planted. That evening, as Bertrand presented what he now considered his reconstructed lamb roast, it had fallen apart during cooking, then been haphazardly reassembled with what might have been mortar. He watched the diner's reactions with new eyes. The king, as always, beamed at the disaster before him. "Marvelous! It's like the lamb exploded and then tried to put itself back together." The visiting baron beside him prodded the meat with visible trepidation. "Is it supposed to look like this?" "Of course," Bertrand heard himself say. Traditional presentations constrain the essence of the ingredients. This way, each bite is unique, a journey. To his astonishment, the baron's expression shifted from horror to fascination. He took a cautious bite, chewed thoughtfully, and said, "It's terrible, but interesting." Bertrand felt a surge of triumph. For the first time in his career, someone had seen past the surface disaster to the deeper artistic statement. Or at least that's what he told himself as he retreated to the kitchens, where Marguerite was waiting with her arms crossed. "A journey," she quoted, eyebrow arched. Bertrand squared his shoulders. "Not all journeys are pleasant. Some are difficult, challenging, meant to provoke thought." Marguerite studied him for a long moment, then sighed. "Either you've gone mad, or you've finally embraced your true calling." She picked up a spoon and handed it to him. "Either way, the king's expecting breakfast tomorrow. Try not to deconstruct the porridge too much. We're running out of clean bowls." That night, Bertrand lay awake staring at the kitchen rafters, the pigeons cooing softly above him. The line between failure and innovation, he realized, was thinner than a perfectly cooked crepe. Perhaps he wasn't a bad chef. Perhaps he was just too far ahead of his time. The next morning, he approached breakfast with renewed purpose. The scrambled eggs weren't robbery. They were texturally defiant. The slightly burnt toast wasn't a mistake. It was an homage to hearth and home. The undercooked bacon wasn't dangerous. It was a commentary on the fragility of life. The kitchen staff exchanged glances as Bertrand expounded on his new culinary philosophy while simultaneously setting a towel on fire. "He's lost it," Claudette whispered. Gaston nodded grimly. "Took longer than expected." Pierre, ever the optimist, offered, "At least he's happy." And strangely enough, Bertrand was. For the first time in his career, his failures felt intentional, purposeful, important. As he presented the king with that morning's conceptual porridge, it had somehow separated into distinct layers of mush, foam, and unidentifiable chunks. He did so with the pride of an artist unveiling his masterpiece. King Florian beamed. "It looks like a swamp. Brilliant." The queen, as always, did not partake. But Bertrand fancied he saw a new glint in her eye as she regarded his creation, something almost like respect, or possibly concern for his mental well-being. In the end, it didn't matter. The dogs were happy. The king was entertained. The kitchen staff had adapted. And Bertrand? Bertrand was exactly where he was meant to be, at the forefront of culinary innovation, one disaster at a time. Somewhere above, the pigeon cooed what might have been approval, or indigestion. With Bertrand's cooking, it was often hard to tell. Chapter 16, The King's Surprising Confession. The revelation came on an otherwise unremarkable Tuesday, as Bertrand presented yet another of his culinary experiments to the royal table. This time a roasted swan that had somehow achieved the improbable duality of being both raw in the middle and carbonized at the extremities. The queen, as had become her custom, delicately pushed her plate away without comment. The visiting dignitaries exchanged glances of quiet horror. King Florian, however, beamed as he always did, and plunged his knife into the unfortunate bird with gusto. Marvelous. The contrast in textures is inspired. It was then that the Duke of Westmarch, a man known more for his bluntness than his diplomacy, finally voiced the question the entire court had been wondering for years. "Your Majesty, How can you possibly eat this? The dining hall fell silent. Even Bertrand paused in his retreat toward the kitchens, curiosity outweighing self-preservation. King Florian set down his fork with uncharacteristic deliberation. He dabbed his lips with his napkin. Then, with the air of a man admitting he'd secretly been a goat all along, he said, "I can't actually taste anything." A collective gasp rippled through the room. The Queen's eyebrows arched slightly higher. Bertrand felt the floor tilt beneath him. "It happened during that hunting accident when I was 16, the King continued conversationally, as if discussing the weather rather than upending Bertrand's entire worldview. Took an arrow to the face. Miracle I survived at all, really. The physicians never could fix my sense of taste afterward." He gestured to the swan carcass before him. "To me, everything tastes like, well, nothing, just varying textures and temperatures." Bertrand's mouth worked soundlessly. All this time, all the ruined meals, the culinary disasters, the borderline poisonous creations, the King had genuinely, literally not tasted any of it. The Duke of Westmarch was the first to recover. "But your compliments, your enthusiasm," Florian shrugged. "I enjoy the theater of it, the reactions, creativity." He nodded toward Bertrand, who was now clinging to a serving table for support. "Take this swan. I've no idea if it's good or not, but look at it. It's a conversation piece." The Queen, in a rare break from protocol, reached over and patted her husband's hand. "I always wondered why you ate those berries that made everyone else hallucinate. They were colorful." Bertrand barely registered the ensuing courtly chatter. His entire career, his identity, his recent existential crisis, all built on a foundation of royal anosmia. The avant-garde culinary genius he'd fancied himself was, in truth, just a terrible cook serving a king who couldn't tell the difference. Marguerite found him later in the kitchen, staring blankly at a pot of boiling water as if it held the secrets of the universe. "Well," she said, pouring them both generous goblets of wine, "that explains rather a lot." Bertrand groaned and buried his face in his hands. "I'm a fraud." "Nonsense. You're the perfect chef for a tasteless king. It's almost poetic." She sipped her wine thoughtfully. "Besides, the dogs still love you." As if summoned by the mention, Brutus ambled over and rested his massive head on Bertrand's knee, drooling affectionately onto his apron. The next morning, Bertrand expected everything to change. Surely now that the truth was known, he'd be dismissed, or demoted, or at the very least, subjected to some well-deserved mockery. Instead, King Florian summoned him to the throne room and presented him with a new hat. An absurd, oversized chef's toque, embroidered with the words Master of Texture. The position of royal chef has never been about taste. The king explained, cheerfully. "It's about entertainment, and you, my friend, are endlessly entertaining." Bertrand opened his mouth to protest, to resign, to confess that even without taste, buds anyone could see his food was objectively bad. Then he caught sight of the kitchen staff watching from the doorway. Claudette gave him an encouraging nod. Gaston smirked. Pierre waved a handkerchief that looked suspiciously like one of the Queen's napkins. And Bertrand realized something peculiar. It didn't matter whether the king could taste or not. The dogs still loved his cooking. The staff had become family. The court jester would still mock him regardless. He placed the ridiculous hat on his head with a flourish. "Your Majesty won't be disappointed." "Oh, I'm certain I will be," Florian said brightly. "And I look forward to every moment of it." As Bertrand returned to the kitchens, he found the staff had already prepared his next challenge, a cartload of suspicious-looking eels and a pot of questionable oil. Brutus wagged his tail in anticipation. Somewhere above, the pigeon cooed. And in that moment, Bertrand understood the truth. Perfection was overrated. There was joy to be found in spectacular failure, camaraderie in shared disasters, and love even in the most inedible of meals. That evening's crispy eel surprise was, by any objective measure, a catastrophe. The king declared it his favorite yet. Chapter 17. The Last Burnt Supper. The Grand Autumn Banquet was meant to be Castle Gluckmon's crowning culinary event of the season. An extravagant display of the kingdom's finest ingredients prepared with exacting skill. At least, that was what the royal proclamation had promised. What it became was something far more memorable. Bertrand stood sweating before the banquet table, his ridiculous master of texture hat slightly askew as he surveyed the disaster in progress. The centerpiece roast boar had somehow fused to its platter. The tower of delicate pastries leaned at an angle that defied physics. And the flaming pudding, the flaming pudding had been a terrible idea from conception to execution. Remember, Marguerite had warned him as he poured the brandy. The goal is to whitely ignite the alcohol, not recreate the last days of Pompeii. Bertrand, naturally, had ignored this advice. Now the blue flames licked higher than intended, dancing along the pudding's crust with alarming enthusiasm. The visiting nobles gasped as the fire spread to the decorative sugar sculptures, then to the embroidered table runner. Within moments, the entire head table was crowned with a ring of fire that would have made a circus performer think twice. King Florian's delighted laughter rose above the chaos. Magnificent. It's like dining in the underworld. The queen, with reflexes honed by years of marriage to Florian, calmly dumped her water goblet onto the nearest flame. Her lady-in-waiting followed suit, then the duke beside her, until a chain reaction of liquid salvation made its way down the table. The resulting steam created a fog so thick that for several minutes, diners could only hear each other's disembodied voices through the mist. Marvelous atmosphere, coughed the Archbishop of Canterbury from somewhere in the haze. Bertrand, certain his career was finally over, this time for good, nearly jumped out of his skin when a hand clapped him on the shoulder. He turned to find King Florian beaming through the smoke, his crown slightly askew from the excitement. "My boy," the king declared, "that was the most entertaining meal we've had in years. But the tablecloth will be remembered in song. The sugar sculptures were too beautiful to last." Bertrand stared. "Your Majesty, I nearly set your guests on fire." Florian waved a dismissive hand. "Nonsense. Only the Archbishop's sleeve caught flame, and he's always been too pious anyway. Could use some excitement." He leaned in conspiratorially. "Do you know how dull state banquets usually are? The last chef's idea of drama was serving the fish course 2 minutes late." As if to prove the king's point, the court musicians struck up a lively tune while servants rushed about with fresh tableware. The nobles, rather than being scandalized, appeared invigorated by the experience, already retelling their versions of events with increasing embellishment. Marguerite appeared at Bertrand's elbow, her usual composure slightly frayed at the edges. "The good news is no one died. The bad news is you've set a dangerous precedent." Indeed, as the replacement dishes were served, under Claudette's careful supervision, Bertrand noticed several nobles eyeing their plates with what could only be described as disappointed anticipation. The Earl of Wexford actually poked his roast suspiciously, as if willing it to burst into song or possibly flames. The evening culminated with what would forever after be known as the incident of the floating meringues, a phenomenon no one could adequately explain, least of all Bertrand, who swore he'd followed the recipe exactly, though he may have confused baking powder with something from the alchemist's tower. The dessert course rose slowly from its platter to hover near the banquet hall's vaulted ceiling, drifting lazily like edible clouds until one particularly brave courtier stood on a chair to pull them down by the ribbons. King Florian laughed until tears streamed down his face. The queen allowed herself a small, secret smile. Even the normally stoic guards cracked grins as noblemen and ladies leapt to catch the floating sweets like children at a festival. Later, as the kitchen staff surveyed the damage, the scorched linens, the sugar-crusted ceiling, the inexplicably Bertrand expected recrimination. Instead, Claudette handed him a bottle of wine. Gaston clapped him on the back hard enough to bruise. Pierre presented him with a charred piece of the original tablecloth, framed as a keepsake. Marguerite, surveying the chaos, simply shook her head. "You do realize you'll never top this, don't you?" Bertrand, still slightly dazed from the evening's events, nodded slowly. He'd spent years believing himself the worst chef in the kingdom. Now, he wasn't so sure. Perhaps there was more than one way to be good at something, even if that something was spectacular, unforgettable disaster. As the last of the banquet guests drifted off to bed, their laughter echoing through the torchlit corridors, Bertrand took one final look at the great hall. The dogs were already cleaning up the scraps. The pigeon watched from the rafters. And somewhere in the castle, the king was probably sneaking off to the pantry for his nightly snack of raw vegetables. All was right with the world. The next morning's breakfast was, by Bertrand's standards, remarkably uneventful. Just a simple platter of slightly overdone eggs and toast. King Florian pronounced it predictable. Bertrand took it as the highest praise yet. Chapter 18. The Chef's Quiet Retirement. Time, as it does for all things, even spectacularly bad chefs, marched steadily onward. The years had turned Bertrand's once dark hair the color of week-old ash, his hands now mapped with the scars of countless culinary misadventures. The kitchen staff had changed around him, though the stories remained. Claudette had married a baker and moved to the countryside. Gaston had mysteriously disappeared after an incident involving smuggled sausage casings. Young Pierre now ran the kitchens with a competence Bertrand found both impressive and slightly disappointing. The king, too, had grown older, though no less enthusiastic about Bertrand's particular brand of culinary disaster. But kingdoms change, palates evolve, and even the most patient of monarchs must eventually consider the structural integrity of their dining halls. The suggestion came not from the king nor from the long-suffering Marguerite, but from an unlikely source: the queen herself. She cornered Bertrand one evening as he was attempting to extricate a loaf of bread from the oven, a loaf that had, against all odds, turned out perfectly golden. This seemed as good an omen as any for what came next. "You've served this kingdom uniquely," she said, her voice dry as the toast Bertrand usually produced. "But even legans must rest." Bertrand froze, a bread paddle hovering in midair. He had imagined this moment 1,000 times, the speeches, the tearful goodbyes, perhaps a ceremonial burning of his least successful apron. But the queen's quiet pragmatism cut through his fantasies like a hot knife, through disastrously undercooked butter. The king, when informed, protested, though Bertrand noted it was with less vigor than when they'd banned jousting indoors. "But who will make my morning eggs interestingly terrible?" The queen did not roll her eyes, but it was a near thing. "I'm sure the new chef will manage." And so it was decided with little fanfare. There would be no grand send-off, no state dinner in his honor, a mercy to all involved. Just a small pension, a cottage on the castle grounds, and the lingering scent of smoke that seemed to follow Bertrand wherever he went. His last day in the kitchens passed strangely quietly. The staff had already adapted to Pierre's leadership, the rhythms of their work continuing uninterrupted around Bertrand as he packed his few belongings. His first charred spoon, the framed piece of banquet tablecloth, the now faded master of texture hat that had never quite fit right. Only Brutus, old and gray-muzzled but still devoted, seemed to sense the change. The great mastiff followed at Bertrand's heels as he made one final round of the kitchens, his nose nudging the chef's hand as if to say, "Yes, it's time." The king did make one small concession to ceremony. On Bertrand's first morning as a retiree, a servant arrived at his cottage bearing a covered platter. Beneath the silver dome lay a perfect golden-brown crepe, the kind Bertrand had never once managed to produce in all of his years of service. Attached was a note in the king's sprawling hand. "Ah, for novelty's sake, Something actually edible. You'll hate it. FF. Bertrand took a bite. The flavors were balanced. The texture sublime. It was without question the worst thing he'd ever tasted. Across the cottage, Brutus thumped his tail against the floor, eyeing the remaining crepe with undisguised longing. Bertrand sighed and slid the plate toward him. Some traditions, after all, were worth maintaining. Through the open window drifted the sounds of Castle Gluckmond waking. The clatter of the new chef at work, the shouts of the stable boys, the distant clang of the breakfast bell. Somewhere above it all, a pigeon cooed. Bertrand leaned back in his chair, closed his eyes, and smiled. The kitchen fire still burned. The dogs still begged. The kingdom carried on. And somewhere, he had no doubt, something was burning, just as it should be. Chapter 19. The next unfortunate soul. The new chef arrived on a crisp autumn morning, his carriage laden with copper pots that gleamed with offensive perfection, his apron starched to an immaculate whiteness that would never survive Castle Gluckmond's kitchens. Jean-Luc Devereaux, formerly of the Court of Fontaine, recently of the Culinary Academy of Bordeaux, stepped into the courtyard with the unshakable confidence of a man who had never once set a soup on fire. Pierre, now head chef in title if not in spirit, greeted him with a polite bow that did nothing to hide the knowing look exchanged with the kitchen maids. "Welcome to Castle Gluckmond, Chef Devereaux. We've heard great things." Jean-Luc waved a dismissive hand, his rings glinting in the sunlight. "Where I come from, we do not hear of greatness, we create it daily." He sniffed the air, where a faint but persistent scent of smoke still lingered from Bertrand's last experiment 3 weeks prior. "I assume that will be addressed." Marguerite, who had come out of retirement just long enough to witness the transition, leaned against the doorway. "Oh, it comes and goes." The grand tour of the kitchens was a study in contrasts. Jean-Luc's face cycled through expressions of horror, disbelief, and finally smug superiority as he took in the well-worn equipment. The stubborn scorch marks on the ceiling beams, the odd assortment of mismatched utensils. "This," he declared, "will all need to be replaced." Gaston's son, younger, broader, but with the same dangerous glint in his eye as his father, folded his arms. "That ladle survived the great kitchen fire of 23. Show some respect." Jean-Luc ignored him, moving instead to inspect the pantry. "And these spices? Ancient? The oils? Rancid? The what with this?" He held up a jar of something even Bertrand had never dared to use. Pierre shrugged. "We call that mystery number 7. Best not to ask." By the time the new chef was presented to King Florian, his composure had begun to fray at the edges. The king, older now but no less mischievous, beamed at him from the throne. "Ah, the man who will finally bring some competence to my kitchens." Jean-Luc puffed up like a well-basted goose. "Your Majesty will not be disappointed. My Gallica Canard à l'Orange alone has brought lesser men to tears." "Tears? How novel." The king's eyes twinkled. "We usually just get indigestion." The staff watched from the shadows as Jean-Luc set to work that afternoon, barking orders in French-accented commands that no one quite understood. Pots clanged with unfamiliar precision. Knives moved in efficient, clinical strokes. The kitchen began to smell of actual food: rich stocks, caramelizing onions, herbs chopped rather than torn haphazardly from their stems. Marguerite, observing from her usual corner, sipped her wine. "He's good." Pierre nodded grimly. "Won't last." The test came at dinner service. Jean-Luc had prepared what he called a simple first meal, a consommé so clear one could read poetry through it, a rack of lamb cooked to jewel-toned perfection, vegetables cut into uniform shapes that bordered on the obsessive. The staff carried the dishes to the great hall with the solemnity of pallbearers. King Florian took one look at the immaculate plating and sighed. How precise. Jean-Luc, hovering nearby, missed the disappointment in the king's voice. "Every element is balanced, Your Majesty. The flavors will—" The king interrupted by plunging his fork into the lamb with unusual violence, sending one perfectly carved medallion skidding off the plate. "Now, that's more like it." Jean-Luc's smile froze. Course after course met with polite applause, but none of the uproarious delight that had once greeted Bertrand's disasters. The queen ate without comment, which, Marguerite noted, was actually a bad sign. At least with Bertrand, she'd egreactity. By dessert, a flawless chocolate soufflé that collapsed at the slightest touch just as it should, Jean-Luc's confidence had begun to crack. They do not appreciate true artistry," he muttered to Pierre. Pierre patted him on the shoulder. "Give it time." Back in the kitchens, the staff cleaned with quiet efficiency, exchanging glances whenever Jean-Luc turned his back. The new chef stared at the spot where Bertrand's framed burnt tablecloth still hung on the wall, now joined by other mementos from over the years: a petrified loaf of bread, a spoon bent at a 90-degree angle, a charcoal rubbing of the infamous chocolate oblivion. Brutus II, son of the original Mastiff, wandered over and licked Jean-Luc's hand in what might have been sympathy or possibly just hunger. Marguerite, preparing to leave, paused at the door. A word of advice? Tomorrow morning try burning the toast. Just a little. Jean-Luc stared at her as if she'd suggested poisoning the royal family. "I would never." "Suit yourself." She shrugged. "But His Majesty does enjoy a good crunch." That night, as the castle slept, strange sounds emanated from the kitchens. The clatter of pans, the occasional frustrated groan. If anyone had been listening closely, the unmistakable sound of something being deliberately dropped into a flame. By morning, the scent of smoke had returned to Castle Gluckman, and in his cottage on the grounds, Bertrand smiled in his sleep, dreaming of fires that never quite went out. Chapter 20. The legend lives on. The castle kitchens had changed over the decades. New ovens replaced the old copper pots shone without the patina of centuries of smoke, and the mysterious jar labeled Mystery Number 7, though no one could agree on how exactly one disposed of something that seemed to glow faintly in the dark. But some things remained stubbornly the same. The scorch marks on the ceiling beams defied every attempt at cleaning. The ghostly scent of burnt sugar lingered in odd corners. And the portrait of Bertrand, the barely edible, still hung crookedly above the main hearth, his ridiculous master of texture hat forever immortalized in oils. Young Chef Mathilde, fresh from the Culinary Institute and full of dangerously modern ideas about molecular gastronomy, stared up at the painting with undisguised skepticism. That's really him? The one who couldn't boil water without causing a diplomatic incident? Old Pierre, now so ancient he remembered the great kitchen fire of 23, as if it were yesterday, chuckled as he sharpened his knife. We didn't have diplomatic incidents under Bertrand. We had diplomatic experiences. The kitchen staff, gathered for their nightly meal before the next day's banquet, leaned in as they always did when the stories began. The newest Scullion, a wide-eyed boy who still jumped at the sound of dropped pans, clutched his spoon like a talisman. "They say," murmured Claudette's granddaughter, "that when the moon is full you can still hear the sound of his disastrous crepes hitting the floor." Gaston's great-grandson, built like a barrel and twice as stubborn, snorted. "Nonsense. But I've seen the dogs refuse perfectly good meat unless it's slightly charred." Mathilde rolled her eyes. "Surely you're exaggerating. No chef could last 40 years without mastering basic techniques." The room fell silent. Then, as one, the staff turned to look at the far wall, where Bertrand's original burnt-offering spoon hung in its place of honor, still bearing the scars of countless culinary atrocities. Pierre cleared his throat. The king's taste buds may have been dead, but his sense of humor was very much alive. Up in the rafters, a pigeon cooed. Perhaps the descendant of that original feathered observer. Perhaps just a bird with excellent timing. Outside, the latest in Brutus's long line of mastiff descendants let out a mournful howl, as if recalling past glories. Matilda, against her better judgment, found herself asking what was his secret. The staff exchanged glances. Marguerite's successor, a sharp-eyed woman who had inherited both the position of royal taster and the impressive collection of wine-stained aprons, leaned forward. He understood that perfection is overrated, and that sometimes the most memorable meals are the ones that nearly kill you. That night, as Mathilde attempted her first official royal banquet, something peculiar happened. The sauce split. The pastry cracked. The perfectly modern deconstructed dessert constructed itself into something resembling a collapsed tower. King Florian V, grandson of the original, took one bite of the disastrous meal and laughed so hard he nearly toppled from his chair. Marvelous, just like in the stories. Back in the kitchens, as the staff cheered and the dogs wagged their tails in anticipation of scraps, Mathilde stared at her failed creations with dawning realization. Somewhere, in the smoke rising from her ruined sauce, she thought she saw the ghost of a smile. And high above, the portrait of Bertrand the barely edible seemed to wink in the flickering torchlight. The legend, it seemed, was in good hands. Somewhere in the castle, something burned. Just as it should.